Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. As you can well guess, one of the really key topics in Plutarch's How to Tell a Flatterer from a Friend is going to be the criteria that we can use to distinguish these two kinds of people who do in fact resemble each other in certain ways. He's going to talk about the flatterer as engaging in mimesis or imitation of the friend in order to achieve what it is that they want. So the key question we have to ask at the start is, well, are there any criteria that we can automatically or even readily use to distinguish the flatterer from the friend? And Plutarch is going to consider three that would seem to be good ones, but we're going to find out, no, they actually are not going to fit the bill. Pleasure is the person giving pleasure to the other person. Praise, are they praising them? Or services. And with each of these, we're going to see that Plutarch is going to tell us that the friend is in sort of a middle position. He's not actually invoking Aristotle's doctrine of the mean, which, by the way, in other works, Plutarch will bring up and attribute to Socrates, not directly to Aristotle. So Plutarch has no problem with that sort of reasoning. And the friend is going to be in the middle position with the flatterer over on one end or extreme, and what should we call them? The unfriendly person who isn't a flatterer but goes too far on the other extreme. So let's look at each of these in turn. He begins by talking about pleasure, right? And he tells us that friendship possesses a certain nobility. It's kalon. It's intrinsically valuable, or whatever you want to call it. It's beautiful, it's honorable, it's also beneficial, and it's got a certain dignity, semnon, right? So it's got a sort of gravitas or a weight to it. Because friendship has this, according to Plutarch, it is actually that gives friendship its sweetness or pleasant aspect. The word there is heidu, right? Describing something as pleasant, and it makes it something that we desire. Polthumenon. It's something that we yearn for. So there is pleasure coming from friendship. And he talks about people who thinks that, well, if you're giving somebody pleasure, you're engaging in flattery. So if you're really going to be friends with somebody, or even not even friends, but just a good person, you should not try to give them any sort of pleasure at all. And it's interesting because he uses some culinary terms here, or gustatory terms. He talks about bitterness, which is one of the tastes that they distinguish, anywhere from 7 to 9 in ancient gastronomy, we could say. And then he also talks about, you can translate it as they do here in the work, just, a cognate austerity, or harshness is another term for it. Now, bitterness is the sort of thing that's at one extreme of taste, all the way opposed to sweet, and it's, the sort of things that we know. There's certain foods you can eat that are bitter. There's a lot of bad things you can eat that are bitter too. What is the austere? So acorns, dry wine, things that make you kind of pucker up, right? They have an astringency to them. That's another way of translating it. And so how would that translate itself into people's behavior? Don't be bitter. Don't make people make a face when they run into you. And don't, force them to kind of dry up when they're around you. That's actually not what gives the dignity to friendship. Some people think that, but that's a mistake, he says. Now, the flatterers are going to give pleasure. Why? That's all they really attempt to give. They use pleasures, as he says, to insinuate themselves. And how would they do that unless they saw that friendship was something pleasant, right? Now, the pleasures that come from it, these are counterfeit, so it's not going to be pleasant as long or as fully, but in the meantime, it can fool you. So, is pleasure going to be a valuable criterion? Not on its own. What about praise? Here we get to something that perhaps is a little bit better to use. So praise, epainos in Greek, and epainesthai, the verb that goes along with that, praising, saying good things about somebody. Could this be what distinguishes the flatterer? The flatterer definitely does engage in praise, but so does the friend. And as a matter of fact, as Plutarch is going to point out, praise given at the right time is no less becoming to friendship, or no less fitting, proseke. The word there is essentially a duty, something that you ought to do, something that is appropriate. That's another way of translating it. So praising at the right time is no less appropriate than is criticism of your friend. And in fact, there's he calls it kindly feeling, eunoios in this case, that gives praise to the other person for the noble actions that they engage in. So if you like your friend when you see them doing things that are good, praiseworthy, honorable, beautiful, you're going to give them praise. Why wouldn't you do that, right? So the flatterer might be doing that as well, right? Doing this actually inclines us, when we're being praised, to more readily bear the negative side, admonishment, and people speaking to us very frankly. There's actually a verb form of it here. Paresia is the noun, and that's usually translated as free speech or frank speech, telling it how it is. If your friend is screwing up, you say, hey man, you're screwing up, right? That's actually being frank with them. You don't candy coat it. And so the verb here is, being frank with somebody. We're more willing to put up with that when somebody has actually given us some praise. How are we if people don't give us any praise and all they have is criticism? Think if you've ever had a teacher who only gives you negative feedback. If you did good, they give you the good grade, nothing on the paper. The red ink is only for where you screwed up. How does that feel? Do you feel like they actually like you? So, Plutarch says that people who express commendation shouldn't be automatically suspected of being flatterers. And as a matter of fact, complaining and fault-finding, the words here are duskolon and memphi these are actually unfriendly, right? Philon, the opposite of friendship, and disagreeable. So the term there is anomileton. So again, you've got these two extremes. You've got the flatterer over here, and they will definitely give praise. Why will they give praise? Because they want to get in good with the person who they want to be deluded into thinking they're actually a friend. We have the unfriendly person over here, and then we have the friend in the middle. But notice the friend is going to provide both praise and criticism, whereas the people at either end, they're either going to provide criticism and no praise, or they're going to provide praise but no real criticism. So maybe this could be part of a criterion, although we're going to see later on in the work, there's tricks that the flatterer will use to seem like they're being critical when they're really not. So what about services? Services and, as it's translated, courtesies, or you could say taking care of somebody. So huporgiais, this is in the dative case, en huporgiais, in services, doing something for somebody else, or taking care of somebody else. How does this work? Well, this isn't going to provide us with a helpful criteria either. If you're going to say, well, I'm not going to do any services because I don't want people to think that I'm trying to get over on them. Again, you're in that unfriendly side. Friends are going to do things for each other, right? And they're going to do things sometimes without even being asked to do them because that's what it means to be friendly. You think about what your friend actually wants or needs or desires. The flatterer is going to go beyond the friend, or as he says, friendship is outstripped by flattery. Flattery beats it at its own game. So you can't use whether you do services or not as the criterion either. So none of these are actually going to work. Now, why is this important? It seems like we haven't achieved any result here. This is early on in the text. We want to be able to say, we're not going to use these criteria all by themselves to tell the flatterer from the friend. That is some sort of achievement. So it's not to say that pleasure plays no role, praise plays no role, or services and courtesies play no role, but we can't use them just by themselves to adequately distinguish the flatterer from the genuine friend.